Hello all and welcome to this evening's webinar on fighting behavioural-based safety. Before we begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Kulin Nations on whose land we are presenting today and pay respect to their elders both past and present. My name is Roxanne and I'm the online organiser in the OHS unit at Trades Hall, and today we are joined by Sarah Ross, one of the OHS officers at the AMWU. So welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Roxanne.
Okay, great. So we'll start off with the outline for today's webinar. So this session we'll be covering some housekeeping quickly. Of course, we will look at what is behavioural-based safety, what is wrong with changing worker behaviour, what you should know about behavioural-based safety, and what you can do about behavioural-based safety. Now, you'll see the image on your screen here. I'm just going to run through some of that housekeeping. So we've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface that you should see. And it should be on your computer desk in the upper right corner. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel, as you can see here. And you may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If you can't see the question area in your pane, you may need to expand it by clicking the little red button here. As you can note here, there is a little hand raising technique which you can click if you have any questions. And don't forget to do your little sound check indicated here by the bars, and if you do need to fix it up, you can see the sound check button here. And as always, we'll send copies of the slides and a link to the recording in a follow-up email after the presentation, and we will aim to get it to you within 24 to 48 hours. Okay, let's begin.
Okay, so what is behaviour-based safety? Well, behaviour-based safety is an approach to safety that focuses, clearly by the words, it focuses on workers' behaviour as a cause of most work-related illnesses. As a result, workers are seen to be one of the main causes of hazards in the workplace, as opposed to what our current OHS laws state. Promoters of behaviour-based safety programs maintain that 80 to 96% of workplace injuries are caused by workers' unsafe behaviours. Now, we know this is not true. Once the program identify the workers who have behaved unsafely, they are coached, cajoled and or threatened to behave safely on the job, or they're sacked. According to the US Health and Safety Executive, which is the same as WorkSafe in the UK, the most common behaviour safety program requires frontline staff to carry out behaviour-based safety observations on their colleagues. The observers are trained and as a result are usually fed back on one-to-one basis. Some programs do not use one-to-one basis but have a group of observers counting instances of unsafe behaviour, collecting the data and reporting back to the group, sometimes developing safe modelled behaviours.
Okay, now we can see the image of this little mouse and mouse trap at the top here, and I think it's quite poignant as a suitable analogy for behavioural-based safety. So, so could you explain why, why this is a great analogy?
Well, I think it's a good analogy because it's making the assumption that this particular mouse needs to look after themselves, but that the headgear is going to prevent them from being injured, and we know full well that the headgear is just not going to do that. Neither is the mouse going to be careful. In this situation.
We've got to focus here on personal protective equipment as though this is the risk control at the moment, and it's not going to make a difference. This mouse is just going to get squashed. So regardless. Now I've got a really good case study here that was sent in by one of our active HSRs, Visalia, and it illustrates the way behavioural-based safety focuses on worker behaviour instead of the hierarchy of control. So I'll just give you a brief anecdote of what happened. So when Visalia began her 12-hour shift with 5 residents who have mild to moderate intellectual disabilities, she was immediately met by one patient at the door who can't communicate verbally. Now, this patient was supposed to have been picked up that day for a day service. However, this was cancelled and it wasn't communicated to him. So he ended up grabbing Visalia's hand and taking her outside in an attempt to communicate that he had not been picked up. And he kept doing this for about 15 minutes, which caused a manual handling injury to Visalia's shoulders and hands. So she put in a near miss report due to a previous arm injury that was exacerbated by the patient continuously grabbing her due to the frustration and lack of information that wasn't communicated to him. And in Visalia's view, the risk of injury was caused by the lack of communication. And so her proposal for controlling the risk control was the development of protocols with the day service staff to inform both house staff and patients when services have been cancelled, and that, of course, alternative activities should be arranged that day. Additionally, she suggested that accurate documentation be lodged. Now, this is quite plausible, makes a lot of sense. So Visalia's response attempts to actually eliminate or minimise the root cause of the risk, which is the lack of communication to staff and patients, through administrative controls. But in comparison, management's risk control solution was for staff to engage with residents and apply an active support principles, or in other words, de-escalation techniques, and utilising verbal prompts and redirection. On top of all of this, management didn't even consult in completing the risk management form. And so what we get out of this is that management's response didn't attempt to eliminate the cause of the risk. Rather, it focused on changing the worker's behaviour as a means of dealing with the risk. And all that does is delay the inevitability of the risk reoccurring. So this is a great real-life perfect example of behavioural-based safety at play. So I'm just going to pop out a poll as we try to do this in our webinars, get it a bit more interactive. Now, the poll, the question for the poll is, has your workplace implemented a behavioural-based safety program? And you can respond as yes, no, or unsure. All right, I'm going to launch it. And all right, so this has popped up on your screen here. We'll give you all 100. Oh, okay, I was going to say we'll give you all a couple of minutes to fill this out, but it seems that instantly 100% of you have said yes, your workplace has implemented a behavioural-based safety program already. So that's overwhelming, and I guess I may as well close the poll, given we've all filled this out at 100% for yes. Okay, so. Now, so surprisingly, no one said you were unsure, but we'll give you a bit more information about how these behavioural-based safety programs do end up creeping their way into workplaces quite subtly.
Roxanne, I think it's actually refreshing that our listeners actually have had recognised that they've had bad behaviour safety.
And I was surprised. I was expecting more people to say they were unsure. Yeah. So yeah.
And obviously the main thing in the behaviour-based safety is the employer shifts the emphasis from the workplace and their responsibility and the hazards in the workplace onto the individual. In essence, they're moving away from what's in the law, which basically focuses on what's called the hierarchy of control, or alternatively known as the order of control. And it's that order of control is what's recommended in the law, basically saying that it's the employer's responsibility to eliminate at source or reduce as far as is reasonably practicable. Many of the codes go into much detail and actually give a list of what that hierarchy of controls, and that list is either 5 or 6 depending upon which document you're reading. So we're going to go with 5. And the first one is to eliminate the hazard. And you can either do this by redesign, taking the hazard away, implementing something where the worker is no longer exposed to that particular hazard. The second one is substitute, and I think probably the most relevant example there is where you've got a hazardous chemical such as toluene or xylem, which is a solvent used in many workplaces, and replacing that with a non-hazardous cleaning agent. Thirdly, engineering controls to prevent workers coming into contact, and that's anything from an isolation booth to an extraction system, and fourthly, administrative controls. This includes administrative controls includes a range of suggestions, including standard operating procedures, but might be posters saying "be careful," might be some training or procedures, standard operating procedures, swims, etc. Finally, and the lowest one is our mouse here, who's wearing personal protective equipment, and we all know that that is seen, yes, in maybe a hard hat, or safety boots, but is also earmuffs, goggles, a face mask, those sorts of things.
So Sarah, so we've pointed out that in this picture we've got this mouse wearing personal protective equipment as the first line of control, defensive control. If we were to follow the proper order, and that's elimination, what would you suggest the response should be for this scenario?
Well, to throw out the mousetrap.
Throw out the mousetrap. There we go.
Yeah.
And yeah, and essentially we're not putting the effort on the individual to do this. It becomes the responsibility
of management.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah. So So basically, personal protective equipment, administrative controls allow that the hazard is actually still there.
Yeah.
So consequently, that's the least effective approach to that. I mean, some examples: staying out of the line of fire replaces effective equipment guarding. So instead of putting a guard up, you tell the worker, "Oh, well, be careful there."
Just watch yourself.
Perhaps the most obvious in the workplace is with manual handling. Constantly lifting, bending, poor posture. But then they're taught to. Workers have training on good lifting procedures.
Lifting appropriately,
but it doesn't stop the fact that they still have to lift. Potentially 100 things off the floor per day, and of 20 kilos, for example.
And that if we were to eliminate that risk, an easy solution would just be to have some machinery lifting that stuff, and not
machinery pumping, whatever the chemical is into the workplace. Certainly in our food industries, we do that sort of thing. Having mechanical lifts, lifts, those sorts of things. Yes,
good alternatives. Yeah. All right. So the question on everyone's head, hopefully, where did behaviour-based safety come from? So the statistics that 80 to 96% of workplace injuries are caused by workers' unsafe behaviour stems from this research that was conducted by an insurance investigator named H.W. Heinrich in the 1930s in the US. So now Heinrich's research consisted of reviewing supervisors' accident reports and drawing conclusions about accident causation from those reports. Most of those reports blamed workers for the accident, and Heinrich concluded that 88% of all workplace incidents were caused by workers' unsafe acts. So the union approach, and that of modern OHS law, all the regulations, is to use the hierarchy of control, which we've just been speaking about. So starting at the source for the best or most effective way of getting rid of the risk, which is elimination, through to the worst or less effective method, the use of safety gear or personal protective equipment. And of course, any combination of these can be necessary because the cause of accidents and ill health have many contributing factors.
Okay, yeah, look, Heinrich's suggestion is a very old one. Yes, it did emanate from the United States, and there were a number of theories in terms of behaviour-based safety. I think probably the DuPont one comes up the most frequently. It's evolved over the last 20 to 25 years. Yeah. But and it evolved in the scope of workplaces also changing quite significantly. Because over the last 5 years, we've got new mechanisation, we've got increased workload, we've got new management, we've got new technology in workplaces, workers having to cope with computers and things like that.
Automation,
and yes, that's right. And but hasn't taken into account that this has added actually more hazards, and so workers are still required to be careful, so to speak,
on top of these
things. But you know, while management is still pushing that productivity, of course, the consequence of that is that the work injuries in the workplace have worsened. Or that certainly there was a significant worsening in a number of workplaces. You know, the most common many years ago when I came into the industry. You know, when this particular behaviour was to have, you know, for example, a press or a conveyor that was unguarded, and workers were told to be careful. But you know, speed increases. Something happens. I had a worker in one of our workplaces who replaced an automatic arm, and he had no training. He'd been on the job for 1 day. He was he was just 18, and he somehow got his sleeve caught in the conveyor and had his arm ripped off. No amount of being careful
would have prevented that.
You know, like, it was just totally unsafe. And of course it was at speed. So yes. So look, you know, increase like I said, there's increased back injuries, etc. So instead of examining the core of where the actual injuries are happening and the causes of it, it became a very easy thing to just say, well, the worker has done something incorrect. So instead of examining that, enter behaviour safety, and it's become ripe. And safety programs claim that, you know, 80% of job injuries are caused by workers, and that's totally incorrect.
Completely incorrect. So, you know, obviously if we're pointing blame on the worker, we're obviously saying that the workers are being careless, or that they're working unsafely. So, I mean, you mentioned this incident previously, but what would, in your experience, what's been one of the most confronting behavioural-based safety programs, Sarah, that you may have come across in your career?
Yeah. Look, I became involved in a very large workplace. It happened to be a print shop, and the management, relatively new management, had trained the workers in observations of workers. So there were groups of workers formed into teams, and the idea was that the team would observe a worker, the way they perform, the way they work, and the purpose was to pick the weak link.
Of course, yeah. So pitting workers against each other.
Yeah, exactly. And so they would focus on a number of safety issues, sort of picking up that, but also it reflected on, you know, the speed, the production, that production efficiency became a focus. But they kept calling it safety, and the consequence, of course, was that workers became fearful, injuries increased. There was a name and shame program in this particular workplace.
I was going to say the antagonism between all the workers and management, that would be quite increased if they're, you know, if being pitted against each other. And there
was also a failure to report safety issues, and it had a perpetually an increasing bad OHS problem. And I actually addressed a mass meeting of all these workers, and yes, you would think that it would pit one against the other, but in this particular workplace, they saw how very bad it was, and there would have been about, I'd say, 400 workers in this mass meeting, and I had workers crying because other workers were being picked on because of this process. It was absolutely horrific.
And can you expand a bit more about why it created a reduction in reports?
Because they were fearful.
They were fearful.
They were fearful. They thought if they actually reported an unsafe action, that they would be considered the weak link, and that they would then be counselled and potentially terminated. You know, it became a really bad bullying case. Actually, people were very anxious, very they were sick from it.
And like what I'm noticing is like, you know, whether we're looking at behaviour-based safety when it was first implemented or how it's slightly evolved over the years, either one of those approaches to behaviour-based safety basically do not address the root cause of the risk, like that they're using external ways to deal with it, whether it's blaming the individual or as a consequence of the programs not reporting as many risks or near misses or whatever like that, nothing's actually getting to the root cause of the issue, and that's really problematic.
That's right. They're not doing what the law says, and you know this was absolutely during you know when our OHS Act was there, and they're not
and still
applying.
Which is alarming.
It is alarming.
All right. So I'm just gonna. I've tried to do a bit of a diagram to show you guys, in case it hasn't been clear at the moment, really what the approach in behaviour-based safety looks like compared to the hierarchy of controls. So obviously, you know, focusing on worker behaviour as opposed to hazardous conditions as the cause of workplace injuries and illnesses leads to approaches where workers are blamed for bad or unsafe behaviour. And so it essentially turns the hierarchy of controls upside down, clearly illustrated here. As we've mentioned before, behaviour-based safety prioritises personal protective equipment where you should be prioritising the elimination of that risk, and so on and so forth as we go down. Now, as a consequence of this inversion, what gets missed by focusing on worker behaviour and what never gets asked is why. So why did a worker not wear safety glasses? Why are the safety glasses needed in the first place? Why did a worker not follow procedure? Workers may not wear safety glasses because their employer buys cheap glasses, perhaps, and they scratch easily and it becomes very difficult to see out of them. Or perhaps they're working in a process where the glasses fog up, and in order to see their work, they need to remove the glasses. Perhaps even engineering controls could enclose the operation in a way that eliminated the need for workers to have to wear safety glasses in the first place. And just what it shows is that blaming workers for not wearing safety glasses allows the employer to never have to explore or deal with these issues. Asking why questions allows an inquiry to get to the root cause, which is the source of the problem that will need to change in order to bring about safer workplaces. And an approach that blames workers for their behaviour prevents root cause analysis and thwarts the real prevention efforts.
Well, yes, instead of having a focus on identifying hazards and eliminating and reducing them, as is expressed in the Act, the emphasis with behaviour safety programs is on getting workers to work more carefully around hazards that shouldn't be there in the first place. When a worker's injured, it's viewed as their fault for not working carefully enough. Discipline can then become management's preferred response to worker injury. Even in cases where a behaviour safety program is implemented, with assurances that there will be no discipline, there are several problems. Workers still often suffer inquisitions when they report injuries to determine unsafe behaviour they are engaged in, and the emphasis for correct actions remain on promoting safe worker behaviour rather than eliminating or reducing hazards. Fear and intimidation descends upon the workplace with a behaviour safety program in place. Workers avoid inquisitions into bad behaviour by ceasing to report injuries and incidents, exactly as I've mentioned.
It's literally what you said.
It's literally exactly as I've mentioned.
Yeah.
When injuries aren't reported, hazards don't get identified or corrected. And by focusing on behaviour safety, the causes of workplace diseases, you know, bad hazardous chemicals, asbestos, etc. Even noise, exactly. Noise is a classic. Employers, you know, they don't get addressed. Employers are also like behaviour safety approach because management are taken off the hook. Management can say, oh, it's them. You know, it seems that we've bred a culture in the workplace where we want to blame somebody, so it becomes the worker, the lowest, the one with the least control, really. Yeah. Gone are the demands for engineering controls, toxic use reduction, and ergonomic job designs. As attention shifts to workers wearing personal protection and using proper body positioning. Gone is the focus on how work is organised and being restructured. Issues like adequate staffing levels, limits on extended working hours, humane workloads and work pace are not even considered. The fact is, good occupational health and safety practices is based in the understanding that all work-related injuries and illnesses are caused by workers' exposure to hazards. That's with behaviour safety. There's no exceptions. In order to have so-called at-risk behaviour, there must be a hazard. If there was no hazard, there would be no risk, and there could be no injury or illness. The goal of workplace hazards, health and safety efforts, then, is to find and fix hazards and to understand and change systems of work, such as unsafe staffing levels, mandatory overtime, extended working hours, and a push for production, which intensifies workloads, creating unreasonable work pace and causes workers to work when they're fatigued.
Yeah. Huge danger working when you're fatigued as well. All right. Now, I'm not sure if many of you came across this ad before, but in June 2013, WorkSafe launched their media campaign to target young workers, and it was called the If You're Not Sure, Ask campaign. And it features a number of stories of young people being severely injured at work. Now, before we go into it a bit further, I'm actually going to ask you guys with a second poll, who has seen this campaign, the If You're Not Sure, Ask campaign? So a simple yes or no. It should appear on your screen now. Oh, again. Okay, so everyone's quite familiar with this. Great. So for those of you at home who may not be, the main point of the ads was meant to be to encourage young workers to speak up. And the narrative of these ads begins with young workers looking to their supervisors for assistance, but as their supervisors are busy, the young workers choose to take the action themselves, and it's seen to be beyond their workplace knowledge, resulting in a severe workplace injury. One of the business directors of the campaign was even quoted saying, "We know that young workers don't regard the workplace as dangerous, and when faced with uncertainty of how to do something, they are often reluctant to ask." Research identified that the concept of showing the potential lifelong consequences of not asking was a very confronting and thought-provoking territory for this group. So one of the second stories, which I will show in a second, is a young man who loses his arm when he reaches into a paper cutting machine. So let me just quickly play it for you. And for those of you watching this as a recording, just head to the link on the PowerPoint slide. All right, bottom of the PowerPoint page here. So while the campaign emphasises the individual behaviour of this worker and attributes his injury to this behaviour, the campaign completely ignores why the workplace was unsafe in the first place. That is, being unguarded or poorly guarded machine, no tag and lock system, etc., etc. So we can therefore see this campaign as an ad promoting behavioural-based safety at work, but it's quite subtle. So Sarah, do you see this subtlety a lot in health and safety?
Oh, absolutely. And this might have been done a couple of years ago, but I would have to say that this is still it is absolutely rampant in our industry, particularly in the print industry, because if you can imagine, there's paper, and very similar to this, there's product going through a process and something gets caught. And in order to stop the process, it's a costly thing.
Yeah.
So workers, even experienced workers, will go, "I'll just grab that," and they get very good at it. The problem is, being good all the time, behaving, doing the right thing all the time is not right, and it's not appropriate. They should just not be allowed to do it.
Yeah.
It should be guarded so they can't do it.
Yeah.
But yes, and look, this subtlety of getting the worker to do the right thing, you know, to report something and things like that, is absolutely rampant in our industry. It often reflects itself in Take 5.
Right.
In fact, I was at training this last week, and I had a worker come to me and go, "Oh, we carry these cards around in our wallets." Now, I know no one can see this particular card, but it's not uncommon for workers to have a little card that says, at the top of it, it's got a little clock, and it says, "Safety time out." All right, it says, "Take a safety time out every time you start work or begin a task. Take time to ask, am I trained? Do I need personal protective equipment? Do I need tools or equipment? What is my role? Should I stop production? Most of my workers can't stop production, and I guarantee they don't get this out, and they certainly wouldn't complain about the fact that whether they've had training or not. So essentially,
it's quite useless, right?
It's absolutely useless, and all it does is it throws it back. You can even hear it in the words. It goes, have I? So instantly the worker is actually going, oh, well, this is my responsibility, but actually the law says otherwise.
And I mean, it's the same as the campaign video. Just because the young worker may not know or may not have been trained on how to deal with the chemical of the workplace, or what was happening with this machine, there's nothing in the video that's hinting at more effective training protocols, for example, for the workers in the video. So it's very, very subtle, and I think that's what gets a lot of people, because they do expect it to be overt sometimes. But what we're trying to emphasize here is that it is insidious, it creeps up, and I hear it a lot, in the terminology, safety is everyone's business kind of thing, and of course that it's valid to a degree, but it doesn't mean that responsibility is on the worker.
And it's something we raised earlier, which was, where is the focus on identifying hazards for them? Where is the focus on eliminating and reducing the hazard? It's not there. It wasn't done. It just makes no sense to not want to address what the hazard is,
Okay, so
we've got some tips for our listeners out there, about what to do with behaviour safety programs. I just want you to be assured that it's not just our unions that think that these are poorly developed ways of addressing hazards, but we've got academics and specialists in the field that also dislike these programs because they disguise the true controls. The basic assumption is that work is unsafe. They disguise the fact that it's the employer's responsibility to actually do that. And in terms of, we'd like to sort of list some facts that will help the health and safety rep when looking at behaviour safety programs. So the first one is observing others' behaviour focuses on the end of the chain of events that lead to a worker's actions. Behaviour safety promotes the fallacy that incidents are caused by one event, when all the research shows a chain of events that leads to the incident.
So number two, observing workers' behaviour does not ask the why questions, as I was mentioning before. Why is the person doing the job in that way? Why are they doing the job in the first place? Why are they using that chemical, etc., etc.? So those why questions are very important to get to the root cause.
Yes, and the third one is observing others, basically looks at what's done often and repeated and fails to take into account things like breakdowns, jams, or days when the staff is shortage, or cleaners that come in after, at the end of the shift. These programs miss the unusual or unseen or complex unsafe events.
Now, okay, 4 we would give you as another tip. Observing what workers are doing does not disclose information about the inherent dangers in a workplace. So the matters over which the worker has very, very little control. Or in other words, observing someone's behaviour does not give any information about the effects of, for example, the fumes, or the effect of dust like asbestos, nor does it address why these hazardous substances are even being used. So nothing really interrogates anything in it. It's quite, how would we say, it's quite, there's no teeth behind it. There's no weight behind behavioural-based safety.
Number 5, observing workers and changing their behaviour can only change decisions making at the lower level of decision making. And it's hard to affect the big decisions, which require senior management, actually.
Number 6, observing workers takes lots of time and money. Over time, this often encroaches other health and safety activity or priority. So focusing on hazards at the source, for example, and the implementation of a hierarchy of control approach.
So linked with number 5 is number 7. Basically, observing workers is basically not observing managers and what the board are doing or not doing, and ignores their legal duties. Managers, owners, or their board are the ones with the power and the access to resources to make the necessary changes for improved conditions. This is recognised in both common law and OHS law as their duty of care.
Yeah, duty of care, very important there. Number 8, observing workers working with clients also cannot answer questions about the factors which lead to stress, for example, fatigue, emotional pressures, workload. Yeah, it just does not get you, you do not see the cause of the chain of events.
Number 9, observing workers tends to end up blaming the worker, even if the program does not intend to. Even if even if it's anonymous, voluntary, it perpetuates that myth of the careless worker. People start to blame. And you know, as we were speaking before, it can. Observing workers can end up putting workers against each other. So that's a list of what we need to be careful of if one of these programs come near you.
So just being aware of it's very important, and of course we want to accompany that with what you should do if behaviour-based safety is being implemented in your workplace. Okay, so if your employer or organisation is talking about introducing a program to focus on everyone's responsibility for health and safety, like we said before, what can you do? First of all, always ask your employer what the hazard is that they are trying to solve by bringing in the behaviour-based safety program. And that's really a really good way to go about this. Reminding your employer that they need to identify the risk and follow the hierarchy of controls according to our OHS Act is important, and that is, in other words, identifying the hazard, assessing the risk, implementing control measures, and reviewing those control measures again. So outside of this important step, here's what else you can do. So be prepared. Know what a behaviour-based safety program is, why it may be attractive, and what the problems are. The second one is ask lots of questions. So don't agree to anything that might sound like a behaviour-based program. Now we've developed a nice little guideline for you guys that you can download, and I'll just pop it onto the screen so you can have a look. Give me 1 second. Great. You should be able to see this shortly. Now, this guideline for determining behaviour-based safety at your workplace provides a list of helpful questions and checklists to use in order to assess whether behaviour-based safety is operating at your workplace. Very simple yes and no, as you can see. And it's also a nice indicator to show you where and what ways your workplace might be blaming the worker as well. Okay, now I'll just flip back to the presentation. Okay, now the third one is that your employer must consult with HSRs. So insist that they are consulting with your reps, as the Act says they must, and use your rights as a HSR to be consulted prior to any changes, which may have an effect on health and safety, as both the Health and Safety Committee or as an individual health and safety rep. 4, contact your union if you are unsure about what it is that your employee is trying to do. Very simple. 5, make sure accidents, incidents, near misses, as well as workload fatigue or unsafe shift arrangements are reported. These are all health and safety risks, and ensure your reporting and accident investigations are thorough and involve workers and health and safety reps. Talk amongst yourselves. Ensure HSRs are informed and have access to the injury and incident report, as they're entitled to. So talk amongst yourself, 7th point. With union delegates and the members about the program, decide what you're going to do, maybe a mass meeting to discuss what the program means. 8, deciding on what your workplace health and safety system should look like. Again, we've developed another guideline for you. And I'll flip to that little screen to show you. Now this one is your behavioural-based safety workplace score checklist, and this list will help show you where your workplace can improve in its systems, and will likely form the basis of a proposal if you wish. So it's quite easy, and these are very good questions to bring to your employer, just to analyse the systems of work at place and what you could do to improve it, so that suggestions for management to improve it without having to implement behavioural-based safety. And just a reminder again, all these documents can be downloaded for you right now if you just click the hyperlink, or they'll be available to share when I upload the recording of this webinar. Now the last one we have is to put your proposal from the last point to the employer, and this will help you challenge their or their consultant's assertion that the behavioural-based program is the magic silver bullet for health and safety. So a couple of good points there. And how much time do we have? We have quite a bit of time, which is great, so we can start answering some Q&As. Okay. So we've got one question in from Visalia, and that was, how do we shift the focus that behavioural-based safety programs do not depend solely on lagging indicators, and instead shift the focus to leading indicators, i.e. preventative ones?
Yes, great question, Visalia. We find that our workplaces are responding using those lag indicators, so that something happens and we respond. And that's when we start to blame and apply behaviour safety. I think it's a work in progress, and I think the questionnaire that we, in terms of the analysis of the workplace that we just put up, is a useful tool for health and safety reps to go through and maybe pick a couple of areas where they think they're deficient. Raise it with management. You might even want to have a chat to your union health and safety officer, or your union organiser, to develop a strategy, and again talk to the shop floor about how that might happen.
Yeah, and I guess it's important to also note that what the behavioural-based safety programs see as preventative is changing the workers' behaviour, so that is their solution to a preventative program. And now Eric has asked, can behavioural-based safety be a useful tool in a whole suite of tools to manage safety in the workplace? So the employee also has duties under the Act to keep themselves and those around them safe, a duty of care.
Look, thank you, Eric. I think I've certainly seen, when you have an absolutely genuine employer who is applying the hierarchy of control, and I don't believe worker analysis is the way to go, but certainly looking at jobs to make them more suitable, more worker friendly, make them more ergonomic, is definitely, and I think that in terms of observations for that respect, rather than watching the worker, I think that then that could be a constructive way forward.
Okay, now just a reminder to feel free to send in any Q&A questions through the chat box. So we have another one here, which is, can one develop their own behavioural-based system, for example, instead of focusing on just actions and behaviours of workers, to focus on the root cause of errors and accidents in the workplace, including motivations or consequences behind the actions?
Okay.
I mean, like, essentially, if it is going to be focused on the root cause, then it's not a behaviour-based model. So there's that contradiction there, that inherently a behaviour-based model will never be focusing on the root cause if it's only focusing on the behaviour.
Yeah, look, I totally agree with that. It's not really, you're absolutely right. I have had workplaces say that it's actually an approach to try and improve culture within the workplace. And my experience is that if you've got a manager that steps up and applies the hierarchy of control, ensuring that consultation is at the centre of everything, there is no need for the behaviour safety approach, because the behaviour safety approach is about basically, you know, observing.
And I think it's also important when we talk about looking at an organisational culture under a behaviour-based safety program. What is that culture? That's the work culture. It's not the workplace culture. So I think it's easy to kind of conflate the two a little bit. So it's important to understand that difference. Now we have another question in by Eric. If you're in a workplace with a poor existing behaviour-based system, is there an example of a good one we can reference?
Simple answer is no, Eric.
I mean, yeah, have you ever come across an effective system, behaviour-based safety system?
Not when it's applied, no.
No,
I haven't.
So when you're saying when it's not applied, do you mean in theory sometimes?
I'm not saying that it's not important. See, I don't want to be misunderstood and for people to think that we don't think that worker behaviour is important. We do, you know, Section 25 of the Act is very clear. We have to, as workers, our workers take reasonable care for their own health and safety and for those around them, which is absolutely reasonable. But a worker doesn't have control on how to fix things using the hierarchy of control. They have no money, they have no capacity to do it. So, and the true behaviour safety does that. I think, again, it comes back to that changing the culture, and that's about leadership and implementing good occupational health and safety practices. If you've got a random person who's not doing the right thing, then you know, we don't condone bad health and safety behaviour.
Okay. All right. Now, are there any other questions? All right. We've got some people loading up any questions, pre-prepared questions at all? Okay. All right. Now, we don't have any questions loading at the moment, so perhaps we should, we can quickly go back to...
Look, I would actually like to say that this is not new that we should be, while we're waiting for questions, this isn't new that we're, we are, as our union and our reps at the workplace, you know, raise better ways of doing things. We also go to WorkSafe and raise this issue of focusing on the individual. And we've had a lot of discussion in the manual handling working group about the best way of fixing, you know, manual handling problems in the workplace. And they're focused, a lot of the research of late is focused on analysing the incident. And it is, what is very interesting is that they're actually drafting and putting out for employers and us to look at is, rather than just looking at the worker, which has been the traditional way of looking at whether manual handling problems, where the cause is, looking up the system. So look up to what management systems are being done. You know, was it reported that it was a poor manual handling? Was there a capacity to potentially have a lifting equipment? And you know, that of course went up through the supervisor to, you know, through a CAPEX, but that hasn't been approved. So consequently, there's been an injury. So asking their employers to actually look up, right up to, as recommends here in our comments, about looking up to the board. So
yeah. And it seems like in the emphasis on that chain of events, that, you know, it makes sense to be able to look upwards in the organisation as well, because there's going to be different layers and different decision making contributing to these problems. You know.
So we're not, you know, the only ones espousing away from the individual, which I think is a really good thing.
Okay. And I guess we can also just make the comment here that there is a difference between formal behaviour-based safety programs rather than programs itself. You know, so there's a behaviour-based approach to safety, which is very, very common, and then there's the formal behaviour-based safety programs. But again, they still are underlined with the same pretense of worker responsibility. Okay, now I've got another question in place. So the argument for behaviour-based safety, as Eric points out, is based on data from the 1930 studies we went over. Is there a more modern or relevant study being done in regards to incident root causes? Do you know?
Well, I can only say what's been done in relation to the manual handling that I've been doing. And yes, this has come from significant research. And to look at what the root causes of incidents are, and it involved a lot of companies, and I think it was a 2-year program. Right. And yes, it's showing that that wasn't the way to go. So I can only say that yes, there is that progress.
So what we're saying is that while more modern studies are showing that it is not the behaviour of the worker isn't the root cause of this, nonetheless, those behaviour-based programs are still, are they still basing it on those 1930 studies, or is it just no? I mean, well, I would have to say, like, if your concept on controlling the risk is always going to begin with the idea of behaviour, it's going to be hard to avoid seeing your approach to those, your approach in a program other than behaviour, right? So if your premise is beginning on that level, your solution is also going to follow on from that level. So I just don't know. I mean, I can't point out at the moment whether those statistics. I mean, actually, some of the research that I did for this was pointing out that the statistics are still based on that 1930 study. But I think even with, more modern research with it, I think regardless, it's still, no matter what those stats are saying, it still sees the solution as being put on the worker for their behaviour, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, look, I'd have to, I agree with you when they're talking about the behaviour state, but I'm hopeful, I'm hopeful that that we've got a slight move, and that when they're looking at certainly the research, it's going to take a long while to actually get this information out to the workplace, and to get it accepted. We've got to realise that this has taken a lot of years to actually become an entrenched part. So, but to actually look at the hierarchy when they're doing their accident investigation, and I think that's what this was doing. Look at the hierarchy, then look up and say why it hasn't happened. This approach, but I think it's going to take a long while. It's become so entrenched that
it's hard to point out where it is sometimes when it becomes so entrenched, right, as a worker. I mean, that would be, if you're ingrained in that in your workplace and you haven't been told other ways of dealing with it, or the proper hierarchy of controls, it's going to make sense to you that it's going to be your fault for not wearing the right equipment, or,
And I don't think our current KPIs and workers' compensation system help either.
No.
Because it's all about
outcome focused, right?
But it's all about tackling that worker who's been injured. So it's not about looking upwards, despite the fact that the legislation is saying, even the workers' compensation legislation is saying, fix the workplace before the worker comes back. It's
that's an excellent point. Yeah, of course.
It perpetuates that blame the worker. And even the worker's sitting there going, well,
I guess,
what did I do that for?
All right, that's an interesting point, actually. All right, now we have a couple minutes left of this webinar, but unless I'm assuming there's no more questions that the audience want to ask us. If there is, we'll give you a couple more minutes. But I always do emphasise that if you do have questions after this webinar, please send them in to Ask Renata. As you can see, the link to fill in a question form is on the slide here, and she'll get back to you as promptly as possible. But with that being said, because there are no more questions at the moment, we just want to say thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar on fighting behaviour-based safety. Once you do leave today's webinar, you should receive a survey on the presentation, and would really appreciate it if you could complete that and provide the feedback back. to us, and you'll also receive that follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar, as well as the ability to download any of the materials we've used. So on behalf of the OHS unit at Trades Hall and Sarah Ross, we thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Roxanne. I had a good time. Thank you.
All right, thank you, guys.
And thank you for your questions, everyone.
Cheers.